This is not in your book. This is now you're getting a canism. It's a warning, something else that came out recently that I want to warn you about, because this is a response you're going to get even when you're doing this. All right? It's a warning about closed-mindedness. There was a new study came out this year out of the Catholic University of Louvain that found that contrary to what the culture seems to believe, religiously minded people actually tend to be more open-minded than non-religious people. All right? We covered this on our story on our Trinity Talk Live episode. If you haven't seen that, go on YouTube. Mark was on it 2 weeks ago, 2 episodes ago, and this is one of our current events that we covered. So he knows how recently this came out. This all came out while I was getting ready for this class. For example, non-religious people were less likely to be able to imagine arguments that were contrary to their own position and find them somewhat convincing. In other words, they were less capable of putting themselves in their opponent's shoes. All right? Now, I'll be honest, I don't normally watch, what's this guy's name? Tucker whatever on Fox News. Tucker Carlson, thank you. I don't watch him regularly. It's just not particularly my cup of tea. But I really got a kick out of this because, and again, Mark can vouch for me. We covered this story on Trinity Talk Live 2 episodes, did we not? All right, Tucker Carlson picked up on it after I did, so he must be watching Trinity Talk Live. All right. But he recently had an episode where he had a guest on, and they were talking about the study. He had an atheist on. They were talking about the study. And what I want you to pay, I've edited it down for time, so it's not overly long, but I want you to pay particularly attention to the way she responds. And what I've actually done, this is my own edit, so you'll see when I put some of her quotes on the screen. When you see the writing come on the screen, that's probably what I want you to pay attention to more than anything else. Okay? But listen to how she responds to Tucker.
Amazingly, though, atheists believe, in general, they are more tolerant than you are. That's according to new research. It shows that atheists think of themselves as open-minded and inclusive. The reality, according to the study, they are actually less tolerant than religious people. Amy Peikoff is a feminist and an atheist who disagrees with the study's conclusion. She joins us now. Amy, thanks a lot for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Tucker. I'm glad to be here. And I think there's one question that can show you what's wrong with the fundamental approach to this study, and it's this. Are you closed-minded if you refuse to seriously entertain or to spread fake news? And by that I mean a media-driven narrative for which nobody has provided any evidence. I would say no, and yet the notion of closed-mindedness at the foundation of this study is essentially the same as that. So one of the things that the study classifies as closed-mindedness is a reluctance to come up with arguments against your particular position. So they ask you to take a position on 3 different questions. They're really kind of odd questions. It has to do with whether you think homes should be painted a light color, whether you think that it benefits society to have homosexuals adopt children, and the third one was whether you think that the meaning of life is a personal question. So, a bunch of random questions. But they ask you, take a position, and then they say, come up with a bunch of arguments against the position that you took, and then they say that they want you to tell them whether they find that persuasive, whether you find that persuasive. So in order to be not closed-minded, according to this study, you have to come up with a bunch of arguments against your view, and you need to say that you find those arguments persuasive.
Not actually true. The study actually says they have to find them to be somewhat persuasive. Didn't say you actually have to change your opinion or change your mind as a result. You should see some value in what they're saying, at least a little bit.
It's not a situation in which you're presented for evidence against your view and you've refused to consider that evidence and then therefore you're closed-minded. No, it's asking you to come up with the arguments.
Well, thank you for explaining that. That's really interesting, and I actually think the study's more valid than I did before. Because that is the acid test. It's really a measure of empathy. Can you put yourself in the position of someone who disagrees with you, and can you mount a valid or a reasonable argument against yourself and see its strengths? And if you can't do that, the question is why? And that is because you can't imagine that decent people disagree with you.
But in the study...
How about just the reality that we see every day? I don't notice Christian groups suing to shut down atheist groups, because they don't. But I do see a lot of atheist groups. I'm not saying... If you're a sincere Christian, and most don't live up to this, but this is the ideal, You are commanded to love those who persecute you, not just those you disagree with, but people who are actually trying to hurt you. There is no such requirement, of course, in atheism. So who's a more open-minded person? The person who's actively seeking to love someone who hates them, or someone who's not?
Sure, but then the question is that sort of open-mindedness actually a value as well? So it defines closed-mindedness in such a way that atheists are going to automatically come out, I believe, as closed-minded, and it's because of the issue that we just talked about, this issue of having to come up with arguments against your view when you don't believe there's any evidence against your view. So there's that. Atheists are probably more likely to follow the basic laws of logic. The preamble of this study said that atheists were more logical.
I don't believe that. I will say, I have to admit, you seem like a pretty logical atheist. But I still
I am. I've been a lifelong atheist.
Okay. I hope you switch, because it's depressing in the end. But thanks for joining us tonight. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
I will say this, for as much as I said, he's not my particular cup of tea usually, but his understanding of Christianity was pretty dead on there, wasn't it? So I applaud him for that. I definitely do. Here's the thing. As an apologist, I hear this all the time, and it makes me want to pull my hair out. 3 times I highlighted what she said there. I don't know if you caught that. Where she says, well, why should I have to come up with, objections to my view when there's no evidence against my view? Look, even I don't say that for atheism, okay? I could stand right now and I could explain to you, the argument for suffering, the fact there's too much suffering in the world, so there can't be a good God out there. I can explain, yes, there is evidence. Now, I'm not persuaded by that evidence, and I think the evidence in favor of God is more powerful. But I'm not going to sit here and say, there's no evidence against my position. Sure there is. And she doesn't realize, I'm sitting here shouting at the screen as I'm watching this every single time she says that. I'm like, do you not understand by even saying that, you're proving Tucker's case? You're proving that you're closed-minded. This is not a content class, and this is just a minimal sampling here. The cosmological argument, teleological argument, moral argument, ontological argument, evolutionary argument against naturalism, argument for proper function, the mythical facts approach, argument to the resurrection. All of these provide evidence for theism, for a belief in God, and many of them specifically for Christianity, all right? How can all of this be out there and you claim there's no evidence? Because you're closed-minded. That's why, because you can't put yourself in your opponent's shoes and realize that these things could persuade some people, all right? So you're going to face up to that, but what I want you to realize is lots of times by asking questions and taking a tactical approach, you can avoid some of that closed-mindedness. Because what's going to happen is if you were to come out and just state, there's tons of evidence, what are you talking about? All right? Mind closed. All right? And you saw that even in this interview, 3 times she said, no evidence, no evidence, no evidence. All right? So instead, what you do is you ask a question. Well, why is it you think there's no evidence for Christianity? All right, and you can try to pull her out and get her to do the talking, and then, as you'll see next week, you can then use questions to actually make a point. You can ask, well, what about the Big Bang, and those that believe in the Big Bang and the cosmological argument? Wouldn't you think that, I understand you're not persuaded by that, but wouldn't you agree that the presence of a Big Bang, at least they would say, is evidence? So whether you're persuaded or not, it's still some evidence, isn't it? And you can work things through like that. All right, this is a real-life example, and I'm trying to rush through because I know we're running out of time. But this is, again, something that, I know it's real small, I'll try to read it to you, that, again, shows you somebody that I came across that, again, illustrates the closed-mindedness that you come across sometimes. This gentleman was arguing the God is a moral monster argument, basically saying the God of the Old Testament is evil. He ordered all these evil things to be done, so it's not there can't be a good God out there that would allow all this evil stuff to be done, and ordered it. Now, the important thing you need to understand is that my first comment up here is my first interaction in this exchange, all right? I had said nothing at all before this. It's the first thing I said, all right? And this is somewhat edited down because it went on forever, and I wanted to fit on one slide. But I said, I'm curious if you studied this issue, because the types of things you're raising have been answered. Could you please articulate for me your understanding of the Christian response to your objections about these passages that allegedly condone murder, etc.? The exact same thing they were doing in that closed-minded study, I asked this person to do. Just all you have to do to answer my objection is just state something. Give me an argument that a Christian has made that you supposedly read about. His response: the passages condone murder. There are no apologetics that somehow fix them or change what they say. Actually, I've read many apologetic sources. Doesn't name any, but hey, he's read many of them. I study religion for fun and hoping to study it for profit one day. What apologetics do you have that somehow change what Jesus said about killing children? What did he just do? Tried to put the burden on me, didn't he? It's exactly what, oh, look, this stuff we're learning in class, here's a real-life application where it really happens. That's exactly what he did. What do I say? You're changing the subject from my original question. I don't think that it's unreasonable, if you really claim to hold a position reasonably, for you to at least be able to articulate your opponent's response. Jeff, I don't need to articulate how a Christian would respond to my objection. Wait a minute, wasn't that my original question to him? All right. They are capable of articulating their own responses. Well, the test here, Jeff, is to see if you are being reasonable. Do you think it's reasonable for a Christian to hold their worldview and completely ignore any responses you raise? No, it's not reasonable for them to ignore the points I've raised. So what's he do again? Try to shift the burden again onto me, right? So how do you justify Jesus saying yada, 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 yada? Jeff, we're still changing the subject. And it went on for a little bit longer from there with the same kind of thing, where and eventually you just kind of have to let it go and hope that you got him to think about it a little bit. But this is why I want to make sure it's clear. My first line, that was the first thing I said. So I wasn't engaged in any conversation. This conversation between Jeff and I started with me asking him a question about a claim he was making. All right? So, this was a Facebook conversation. Yeah, that particular one. There's been some things I've had in person, and if so, I'll try to make sure you know that that's not a quote, but those were direct quotes. And some of them are, I used to write for there's an international apologetics blog called the Christian Apologetics Alliance. If you want to, you can just Google that, Christian Apologetics Alliance. You click on the About Us tab, and there's a link for authors. You click on authors, you can find my name on there. I haven't written for them for 4 or 5 years now. But I just don't have time, but I used to write quite regularly. And so some of the conversations come from that as well. I think the one from last week was from that. Here's the important thing that you need to learn. In these types of situations, sometimes it's going to be important for you to do what's called narrate the debate. And this is when someone's trying to do like what Jeff was trying to do, where they start trying to dodge the question, and they try to change the subject. All right? When they do that, don't let them do it. All right? What's going to happen is if you do, you're going to end up on all sorts of rabbit trails, and you're never going to answer anything. All right? So what you kind of need to do is, like I did with Jeff, is you kind of need to restate what's happening, all right, and then try to say, okay, well, you know what? You raised a good point. You raised a point earlier that I asked you about, all right? Now you're kind of raising a different point, and that's okay. We can talk about that if you want to later on, but can we get back to this one first? And let's address this first before we move on to something else.